Hello everyone and welcome to the game of the day after day one of the Chessable Masters by Chess24. Today I'm going to present one game as my game of the day. I'm going to try to do that I think every single day of this event. As you probably have seen, I also published an endgame of the day, a blunder of the day. These other categories might change a little bit. And today, as you can see on the screen here, I picked a game between Harikrishna and Grischuk. There were a couple of candidates. People I think always expect us to pick a Magnus Carlsen loss because he loses, quite rarely, and it's always a big thing when the world champion loses. His loss today against Dubov was an interesting game. So it was, and there was the question of whether he hung the exchange or blundered the exchange. I decided not to go for that game because, as he himself described in the interview after the match, first of all, it was a sacrifice. He did get incredibly good play, and then it just wasn't his best game. And so while Dubov, of course, deserves credit for winning, I didn't think that it warranted that. Now, this game in particular that I chose, Harikrishna against Grischuk, first of all, it was nice to see Harikrishna win. This was played in the fifth round today, the last round, and so it was nice to see him come back after having struggled quite a bit. I think he lost the first three games. So it was nice to see him come back with a win. It's not a perfect game by any means, but I thought it was really interesting because the plans in this Italian, which is a very topical opening, are confusing, interesting, complicated, a little bit of everything. And so this game has some attacking, some positional concepts. So I thought, with the hashtag study chess, it was a good game to go through, to learn a thing or two and have fun doing it. So it starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, d6. Now this position, for those who don't necessarily follow high level chess all the time, it used to be, let's say 10 years ago, everyone was playing the Ruy Lopez on move 3 with bishop to b5. And then when the Marshall and the Berlin sort of became really hard to beat for white, black was just solid and managing to equalize in a lot of these games. White started to explore other ways. And of course, with this kind of setup here with the Italian, you get a very similar structure. Without having to contend with the Marshall or the Berlin, because there is no real way for black to try to exchange pieces in that manner. So we get this structure by force. Of course, there are drawbacks. You're never threatening to take the knight on c6. It's therefore harder to push d4. And black does have, easy development without immediate problems. But now this move, a4, is something that has again become really, really popular in the last decade or so. So much so now that it's almost considered ubiquitous, and it's played a ton in high level chess and in lower level chess as well. But a4 is an interesting move. In some cases, white tries to grab space, and in fact that is a threat right now on the queen side, and they're not letting black it's not as simple as thinking white is going to play on the king side, with the plan knight d2, knight f1, knight g3, sometimes h3, knight h2, and f4, things like that have been the traditional plans. White is sort of saying, I could play on the queen side as well, so let's just keep it very flexible. This also gives the bishop an extra square. Sometimes the bishop comes to b3, but now even on knight a5, bishop a2 is possible, so you don't have to leave this optimal diagonal that eyes the f7 pawn. So, long story short, black plays a5, which is not, this is not forced by any stretch of the imagination. There are other ways for black to play. But the way this game goes is very interesting and non-traditional. White plays bishop g5. Now, this bishop g5 idea is one of the more challenging ways to play for white, because you're immediately pinning the knight on f6. And that pin is hard to break unless black wants to play h6 and g5, because they can't bring their bishop back to e7 now that the pawn is on d6. So it's a very it's a move that is an optimistic, a move that tries to accomplish something real, versus the more, you can play, of course, more quiet moves like knight d2 or h3. It does allow h6, bishop h4, and g5. Now note, in these positions, if white had already castled, let's say, for example, we just gave white an extra tempo and they've castled. Well, then g5 is probably going to be really good for black. So it's important to understand these nuances. If the king is already on g1, black plays g5, they can really start expanding on the king side. Their king has not decided where it's going yet, and it would probably stay in the center. And these positions are really dangerous. If black can play g5, rook g8, h5, h4, g4, this can just be, you can just get checkmated in 15 move as white. So it's important to know when to castle and when not. And so the plan of bringing the bishop to g5 is not generally played, if you've castled right away. So, because if the bishop is still on c1, you could sometimes play bishop e3, which will at least force a trade of that bishop, reducing the number of pieces that can attack your king. So that's very important. But here black plays g5 anyway, bishop g3, and now white is not in any kind of immediate trouble because the king has not gone to the king side, so it's got more flexibility. So there's not going to be an immediate crushing attack against the king. And now black plays an interesting move, and if you've never studied these kinds of positions, black castles here. So you may wonder, why is he castling when he just played h6 g5? The fact is that the king is actually quite safe there. And so it is a perfectly reasonable move, as we'll see. There are other possibilities. There was one game, for example, played by Gata Kamsky that went with knight h5 against a grandmaster named Paravian, and it does lead to a crazy tactical variation after knight takes e5, which I'll just show quickly. Knight takes e5, knight takes g3. So now white can take on f7. So this gets messy, and it's a weird sort of material balance here where you got to check. If you take here, then of course black would just take the knight with either piece, and they'll be up a piece for not enough compensation. But white can play here, knight h8, queen h8, pawn takes g3. And so now what's the material? White has a rook versus two pieces, but if you count the pawns, black has 6, and white has 8 pawns. So you have 2 pawns for the rook and for the 2 pawns and a rook versus 2 pieces. And typically, especially when you have like such a fluid center, white is probably to be preferred. Although in that game it was complicated, but Gata Kamsky did win as black. But Grischuk here goes for castling. There's other moves as well. There's a lot. We could look at this opening in great depth, but it's very complicated. White plays knight d2. Now he goes knight h5. So now there isn't the same kind of idea because this check doesn't work, right? So, and if we play knight takes e6 here, there's actually sort of a typical motif here that allows black. So you don't want to just take the knight because here white would have won a pawn. That would be good for them. But by taking on f2 first, you're forcing the king to come here. Then you can actually take the rook with check, and then you take the knight. And now black is up in exchange and probably winning position. So there's no knight takes e5. So white plays h3, an interesting move that allows black to take on g3 if they want. But it's a fairly ambitious move because in some cases, white will be able to keep that bishop, and with that, they can start trying to say that black has weakened himself too much. So it's still a very interesting position. Queen to f6. It was also possible, if you're wondering, is this bad to take on g3? I don't think it's bad. It was also interesting. You got to keep in mind though that here white might want to do something like g4, knight f1, knight g3, really get control of these light squares. And even though it looks like white's king can't castle, sorry about that long arrow, the king is actually fairly safe in the center, and it's not so easy for black. Black is not going to get f5 very easily because white will play g4 and not let them. So, I mean, the position is probably roughly equal here, but it's understandable why Grischuk decided to play queen f6, which is more flexible. He retains the possibility of playing knight takes g3, and Grischuk is one of these players that seems to like to kind of keep things very complicated, keep a lot of options. White plays queen e2. Again, a very understandable move. He's possibly warming up to the idea of putting his king on the queen side, which ultimately he's going to do in this game. But it's even interesting. I looked at this, with an engine after, and the engine sometimes like even playing king d1, king c2 as a way to getting getting the king to safety, because sometimes the rook is actually useful to defend the a4 pawn in the short term. Now Grischuk plays king h8. Again, this is sort of typical Grischuk. Doesn't want to clarify the position, keeps all the options open. It was also possible to play either knight f4 and knight takes g3. Again, all these moves are possible, but he plays king h8. Now Harikrishna decides to try to keep his bishop. Knight f4. And so Grischuk probably played king h8 thinking, if he goes bishop h2, I'll have one a tempo, because it is very useful to have the king here after bishop takes f4 gf. We can see that the g file is open, so the rook could come here, but also white is likely to try to open up this file, and so it's nice to have the king having already sidestepped that. So g4 played. And so here was actually a very critical moment for Grischuk, and the decision not to take on g3 is quite interesting, because I think I would have been tempted myself to take, pawn takes, and make a move like either queen g7 or knight e7. The knight is not very well placed on c6 anymore, something like that, with the idea that the knight can come to g6. And again, this position is quite messy. White, black might try to play c6 and d5. They might try to play bishop d7, and if the, so that the king can't easily castle, attacking this pawn. Of course, white is not without play. White probably plays g4. I looked at this. The knight gets to a very nice square. But that being said, a position like this, the king is coming to c2. It's kind of anybody's game. It's just a very complicated position. White has chances, of course, at some point to play some h4, g5. It's just going to be a messy game, but that was also interesting. Grischuk decides not to open up the position and plays bishop d7. I don't think there's anything wrong with that plan, by the way. Now white castles long, and that's an interesting decision. The computer actually likes moves like bishop b5, which are sort of mysterious. It does something. It kind of protects the a4 pawn, so maybe it makes castling better on the next move if you can achieve it. But on the other hand, I don't really know that white can be that much better here as the computer suggests. But this is the move that sometimes the computer it's actually hard to explain. Why their moves are so good. Of course, when you play against them, you realize that they're right most of the time. And here I guess the plan would be to play knight h4. I looked at this. It does look a little bit better for white. So it's possible that castling long was a bit of an overly ambitious move. And Harikrishna actually, when he talked about the game after, said that he was kind of a little bit more relaxed, maybe because he had not had a very good day, and so it made sense for him to just kind of do his best, not be too worried. Losing one more after you've lost a couple, it feels a little less bad. When you haven't lost and you lose one, then it's always a humongous psychological obstacle. So rook g8, rook g1. So now it makes sense. Of course, if white could, they would play h4 g5. So black immediately puts all the pressure that they can against that pawn, and both sides are clearly eyeing the idea of playing g5, and it's clear that if it could happen without being punished, then white would be doing really well. On the other hand, on the queen side, black is likely to have the upper hand, right? If they can move their knight away and play for b5 somewhere or attack that pawn, then of course they could have a very nice position. They do have two bishops also, which normally is a little bit better than a pair of knights. One thing I forgot to mention, this is just kind of funny. Harikrishna had a game against Hikaru where they got this pawn structure as well, where the pawn gets to b3, and then this pawn structure of a4, b3, c3, d3, e4 was called on our stream the extended bathtub. And I thought that was very funny. I'd never heard of this concept. And it's just funny because with the reverse colors here, Harikrishna had a chance. And in fact, in some positions, b3 is not such a stupid move because it protects the pawn on a4. And so he could have gotten two extended bathtubs in one day. All right, Grischuk plays bishop a7. Sort of a useful move, not necessarily... the main idea of it is that if you move the knight away, very often white will have ideas like d4. So if your bishop has gone back, then you're not a target. So it's a move that's very reasonable. Now Harikrishna decides to go for broke. It seems like the more stable move that he could, so he plays knight h2 here. The more stable move was to play bishop b5. And the idea of bishop b5 here, and bishop b5 is very typical of this variation with a4, especially because black has played a5 often. And so the bishop is actually well anchored here and is not easily targeted. And the bishop does a few things. It makes it harder for this knight to come to nicer squares. And also it makes it hard, of course, for obvious reasons, to play b5 because it actually occupies the square. So it's a reasonable move, and white would probably be happy to trade off. Usually you're happy to trade off the bishop. If you're playing against a bishop pair, it's usually a good thing to not let the two bishops team up. So that would have been a reasonable move, and with again a very strategically complex position, probably about equal. But Harikrishna finds this very aggressive, ambitious idea and decides to do it. So he goes knight h2, knight d8, and now he plays h4. And so this is a real sort of sacrifice. The other possibility was to play something like knight to f3. But then black would probably, black has a few things that they can do. I mean, the first thing is that he might feel like the pawn on a4 doesn't need to be sacrificed. But here he is threatening g5. So probably black would make a move like queen e7 with the idea that on g5 you can take the pawn on h3. And it's not that trivial for white to untangle themselves. They could play something like h4. But now I think there's a few... It gets complex, but you can make a move like, let's say, I don't know, if we play, what did I look at here? C6, then G5, and then black can play something like B5. And we have a super double-edged position where even though white has been able to play G5, they don't have an immediate kill here. If they could get the queen to H5, or if they could play GH and crack things open. But here it's just kind of double-edged. Both sides have play. And I'm not sure who's better. It's just a very messy, complicated position. The computer thinks it's equal for what it's worth, but I think as a human, you feel like this position is highly unlikely to end in equality anytime soon. It's more likely to just stay really complicated. But in the game, Harikrishna goes h4. Grischuk takes it. He probably doesn't see a refutation, and so that's definitely the critical move. Knight f3, queen e7, sorry, g5. And so this idea is a beautiful idea. Unfortunately, it looks like it falls a little bit short if black makes the correct move here. But it is a beautiful idea. And so in the game, Grischuk played knight to e6. So let's look at the alternatives. So first of all, if pawn takes g5, then knight to g4, and now it looks like white is getting a ton of play for the pawns that they've sacrificed, and the immediate threat is to play knight h6, attacking the rook and forcing a piece away from g5. And here, if you play something like rook h7, there's knight takes e5, which is very beautiful, and then you crash on g5 next move. So pawn takes e5, knight takes g5. And now these threats are becoming extremely dangerous. I mean, white is probably just completely winning at this point. But the immediate threat is knight takes f7 with rook takes g8. So this is if you simply take on g5. Now, there is a better move, though. The move was bishop h3. And that move, the thing is that it's a little bit tricky to spot because you immediately spot with black that white is not threatening to take on h6 because the rook is hanging. So you feel like that's not really a problem. And so it's easy to miss bishop h3. And it seems like both players missed it. It does, however, trap the rook. And so after something like knight g4, bishop g2, pawn takes g2, black can probably calmly take on g5. And then... so black is up the exchange and a couple of pawns. So it's a lot of material. And knight h6 can be played, which attacks this and wants to play knight f5. But I think here black is able to consolidate. There's more complicated moves, but the simplest way is to play queen to f6 with the idea that on knight takes g8, you simply take back. And you're up 2 pawns. I don't know that black is, winning here, but it's certainly black that has the advantage. So unfortunately for Grischuk here, he played knight to e6, and now suddenly the position becomes completely untenable. So it's pretty impressive how quickly White's attack builds up here. He plays knight g4, and now he's getting ready to switch from the g file to the h file. And there's not an easy response. And the other thing, of course, is knight takes h6 is the idea with knight f5, as we saw before. So black takes on g5. At this point, Grischuk did not manage to find a way to resist. But actually, even looking with the computer, there is no real way to resist. Knight takes g5. Knight takes h6 doesn't help at all. For example, here, there's actually, I did want to show, where is this variation? Oh, actually, I forgot to show one beautiful variation, which is not at all forced, but on bishop h3, knight g4, we were looking at this position here, h takes g5, knight h6. The computer's first intention is to play g4, and I didn't show this move because I thought queen f6 is a simple and more human line. But g4, there was something really beautiful that I spotted, and I do want to show you this position, which is that white can play queen f1, and then on pawn takes f3, which is not forced. Black has other moves. But look at this position. I've almost never seen a position like this. Queen to h1. This is actually amazing. The threat is knight takes f7 mate. And there's no real good way to defend against this. So first of all, pawn takes g2. Knight takes f7 is double check, so it's actually mate. It doesn't matter that you're attacking the queen. Rook h7 doesn't work because of rook takes g8. So it's actually just mate. There's all black can do is give pieces away. So that is a beautiful variation. I meant to show because when I saw it, I was just kind of amazed by it. So, but going back, so we were here knight g4, and yet here it's just a collapse for black. Grischuk plays pawn takes g5, knight h6. And it's not the material, because material-wise, black is actually doing quite all right. However, the position just collapses because he just can't hold everything, right? So like, let's say he tries to make a move that cements the g5 pawn. Well, now knight f5 is really strong. Queen f7, and then rook h1, rook h7, rook h2. And so everything is just collapsing in the black position. It's pretty surprising how quickly it happened. So he played rook h7, knight takes g8, king takes g8. And now, again, if he has one move and played f6, he might be okay. But knight takes g5 crashes in. And yeah, here now he's not up material anymore, and the king is in really big trouble. So it's just resignable, and he did resign here. So to sum up, well, I thought this was an interesting opening, and one that allowed you to kind of learn a little bit about this this complicated variation of the Italian, which even though on the face of it looks a little bit quiet, there's a lot of nuances with castling, when to castle, and then there's a lot of plans for both sides. So hopefully, looking at this game shed some light on that. I will be back some more, obviously, tomorrow for round 2 when Group B faces off. And yeah, I hope you will join me again for Game of the Day and some of these other segments that I'm filming during this event. Thank you.